From Infinity and Beyond, it's Super NES Works Episode 13. In the years I've spent in the games press, I've had the opportunity to meet game designer Peter Molyneux on a few occasions. Molyneux has a reputation for being something of a, shall we say, bullshit artist. And who knows, maybe that's true. My perception has been that the man genuinely believes the things he says. Even if his mouth has a tendency to write checks his work can't quite cash. Or maybe he's just charismatic enough to sell his tall tales. I kind of doubt that though. I once sat in on a PR meeting to watch him presenting Fable: The Journey, and he had the look about him of a man whose heart was definitely not in it. On the other hand, when I interviewed him a few years later about Goddess, he carried himself with the conviction of a true believer, a man returning to build on the work on which he had established a career, namely the PC classic God Sim, Populous. Whatever you want to accuse Molyneux of, there's no denying the fact that he played a critical role in one of the most influential and visionary simulation games of all time. Goddess, which arrived about 25 years later, didn't have the impact of its predecessor, but it definitely came across as a game its designer believed in. In speaking to Molyneux about Goddess, I mentioned that my experience with Populous had been limited to this, the Super NES conversion of the game. He seemed aghast. "Oh no," he groaned. "That was the worst one." I can't say I really agree though. Populous for Super NES is a robust and well-crafted adaptation of a computer simulation to a more limited platform, incorporating elements of the PC game's expansions to result in a unique version of a classic. It probably helps that Populous was ported by someone with a genuine passion for the game as well. Many times PC to console recreations assembled by little-known Japanese studios turn out to be hardly worth the trouble. Please see any number of Game Boy Works videos for examples. In this case though, the studio in question, Infinity, got its hands on Populous as a result of its boss's passion for the project. Infinity is still around today and it's run by a man named Yukio Horimoto. Horimoto had found some success in the early 80s by developing some productivity software, and he invested his earnings from that project into establishing Infinity, a company centered around Horimoto's love of video games. Although Infinity never had much luck with its own original works, including NES cult classic The Battle of Olympus, it eventually carved for itself a niche, converting Western-developed games to Japanese consoles and computers, usually for publisher Imagineer. Populous, it turns out, was actually the game that precipitated this move. Horimoto saw previews of the game in imported computer magazines and found himself entranced by them, and he managed to convince his publisher that they should pursue the license. Following the success of that project, Infinity would go on to convert a fair few American and European games for Japanese systems. A sweet gig that ended abruptly when Windows 95 launched and essentially killed the Japanese PC market by making Windows a global standard. Here at the beginning of all things though, Infinity did a solid job transforming Populous to a Super NES cart. Really, the worst thing you can say about this port is pretty much that it arrived far too soon to be compatible with the Super NES mouse. Of all the PC-based simulation games Infinity could have picked up though, Populous seems uniquely suited to a console adaptation. It's a somewhat complex game, yes, but it doesn't revolve around menus and function keys. The Super NES conversion even throws in a number of button combo commands to replicate the classic "I can't play this without a key-binding card in front of me" experience PC gamers knew in the 90s. Instead, the entire game interface appears in the form of a virtual magical desktop. An overview of your land displays in the pages of a book in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, while the active play space sits in the isometric main window. Surrounding the central window, you have multiple palettes of command icons, all abstracted neatly to transcend language. The result falls somewhere between SimCity and a real-time strategy game. Not that the term real-time strategy existed here in 1991. Unfortunately for Populous, here on Super NES it doesn't simply fall close to SimCity's release, it falls right in between SimCity and the platform's other 1991 God Sim game, Quintet and Enix's inventive ActRaiser. Populous is a solid port of a computer game to console, but SimCity was radically reworked for Super NES, and ActRaiser was built ground up for the system. This unfortunately means that Populous fares the worst of the bunch, which isn't to say it's without its charms. The game contains more than 900 stages to master, some of which are handcrafted and some of which are procedurally generated. Not that you'd really want to play nearly 1,000 of these stages, and in fact it's possible to leap ahead several levels at once by performing well, kind of like an obnoxiously smart kid getting to skip a grade in school. And, like that little nerd, you can expect to get roughed up as a side effect of your sudden advancement. The game has a pretty steep curve. What makes Populous on Super NES interesting is the combination of its mechanics and its varied settings. The worlds within the game come in 10 different themes ranging from snowy tundra to European-flavored cityscapes. Infinity also incorporated a few new novel stage themes for Super NES. The questionable Wild West setting from the PC version is now Japanesque, with developer Infinity's indigenous samurai replacing the original American Indian stereotypes. There's also the alien Silly Land, the computerized Bit Plains, and the whimsical Cake Land. Each setting has its own distinct traits, which determine the harshness of the environment and the speed with which your followers develop. Therein lies perhaps the most interesting aspect of Populous, controlling followers. As in all of these sim games, Populous centers around the development of a civilization over which you have little direct control. And of the 3 sim games to appear on Super NES in its early days, Populous is the most overtly religious. Sure, ActRaiser starts you off by talking to an angel, and the villain was named Satan in the original Japanese script, but Populous goes beyond the basic trappings and casts its clashes between settlements as crusades of sorts. Your villagers will fight against the computer's peoples when they cross paths, and your greatest chance of victory hinges in large part on the number of citizens you elevate to knighthood. And the central control icon may look a lot like the Ankh seen in the Ultima games, but it's called the Papal magnet. The hazards your people face, and that you can unleash against the computer, are such cheerful biblical crises as floods, plagues, and even something called Armageddon. It's actually somewhat surprising that Nintendo let this stuff fly in the US version. The company's American branch was still in its uptight no religion please phase in 1991. The real Old Testament stuff, however, is what you'll find in one of the game's most basic mechanics, the ability to literally reshape the land. Your Divinity grants you the power to raise and lower land masses, not quite at will at first, but eventually with something approaching impunity. By shifting the topography of your lands, you can send the enemy plunging into floodwaters, or turn their arable land into useless swamp. Alternately, you can elevate your own people and give them an advantage over the foe. All of these things, from shifting elevations to summoning a biblical flood, cost mana points. And for once, no, that's not mana in the Old Testament sense, but rather just standard video game magic points. By performing smart deeds and leading your people to prosperity, you can gain additional mana with which to perform further miracles. Really, it's pretty standard fare for simulations. SimCity mainly differed by calling its mana revenue and giving you a wider array of ways in which to invest it. As you gain mana here, you can spend it to perform divine actions. The more powerful the action, of course, the more it costs to activate. You can shake an area with an earthquake, summon a volcano, all kinds of nasty stuff. Many of your powers potentially inflict collateral damage on your own people though, and the AI has access to many of them as well, especially in more advanced levels. So it's always wise to leave some mana in reserve for rebuilding after a quake, or for raising your people to safety after a flood. Populous on Super NES holds up fairly well today. It's not as fluid and easy to use as the PC versions of the game, thanks to the lack of mouse control, and it lacks the punchy console-centric design sensibilities of Nintendo's version of SimCity, and the upcoming masterpiece ActRaiser. Still, Infinity did a fine job transforming Bullfrog's seminal strategy game into a 16-bit cart, which means those claims that this is the worst version of the game amount to just another one of those Molyneux proclamations you have to take with a grain of salt. Next time on Super NES Works, its base is loaded. But is it really as super as the name suggests?